Welcome back. You're still watching The Globe. Let's now continue with our conversation looking at education in South Africa. And today, well, all the schools were back. They were open, educators busy educating, and pupils hopefully getting their first day of learning. To help us unpack some of the bigger issues, we're now joined by a Senior Research Associate at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Mary Metcalfe. Prof, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Always good to have you on the programme. What sense do you get about today? There were a lot of people holding their breath, concerned and worried about going back to school today. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that we underestimate how much has been achieved over the last year and a half of the pandemic. Schools are in the routine of making sure that they operate as a barrier to infection, using the PPEs to make the schools safe for learners. And schools worked very well for the first half of the year. What has changed is firstly the third wave of the pandemic. And we've seen that the figures are beginning to decline. And we also have had KwaZulu-Natal in particular affected by the recent unrest. But schools are back, and they are back to doing what they have done very well for the last year.
All right, COVID-19 is still with us. Do you think that we are prepared to teach in a COVID-19 environment? The MEC in KwaZulu-Natal told us that everything is there, PPEs, but we've just finished a story there about a school in Northern Cape where parents are scared that this school might just actually collapse because of issues such as maintenance, that perhaps we may have been focusing on COVID-19 and not done all the other work.
Okay, so first, schools have been receiving the PPEs since they opened in July or August last year, and we need to celebrate that year. And it's not only receiving the PPE, but also knowing how to use them. What many people don't realize is that the funds that were required to supply the PPE to deal with water and sanitation issues had to come from within the education budget, so that came from some of the provincial allocations and also from infrastructure. So while the country has worked hard to keep education on track, and I think we need to acknowledge not only the work of the leadership, but also in every school, the principal and the teachers who've made it work, there are going to be long-term consequences because we've had to take money away from infrastructure. Money doesn't grow on trees, I suppose my mother used to say, and we need to know that we have to look after our resources very carefully, because COVID has also exacerbated inequalities, but it's certainly shone a light on inequalities. Where schools have water, where schools don't have water, where schools need additional assistance with, for example, infrastructure, and the extent to which learners are able to work at home differs across our inequality.
Let's deal with some of the bigger issues now. We are in July, August pretty much, so this year is really well and truly coming to the sort of countdown. Grade 12s are probably quite nervous now. A lot of time has been lost, and I wonder if 8 can even be caught up, or is it just a question of mitigation strategies at this stage?
We need to understand the catch-up in terms of how much time learners lost last year, how much time they've lost this year, and how that affects the different phases of the schooling. So, for example, the Matric learners, those learners who will be writing the National Senior Certificate, when all eyes will be on them at the end of the year. This class of grade 12s was in grade 11 last year, where they lost a huge amount of time. Last year's grade 12s had a full year of grade 11 in 2019, but this year's grade 12s need a great deal of support from schools because they lost so much last year. But they have been attending every day. They have not been rotating. So government has prioritized the grade 11s and 12s so that they have not been rotating. But if you take, for example, learners in the foundation phase, they need to be supported to gain the fundamental skills of reading, of numeracy. And last year, they lost a great deal of time when we had the lockdown before they were able to return to school in July, August last year. And this year, they returned to alternating days. That's very disruptive for young children to be at school one day, to be away from school the next day, especially when they're not in environments at home where they are supported and supervised. And the research is showing, the CRAM study in particular, the NIDS CRAMs, that there has been huge loss of learning because of the loss of time, as well as some of the other key functions that school plays, such as providing nutritious meals. The push that the DBE is leading to get all primary school children back to attending every day is critically important. You double the amount of time that they now have relative to where we've been. So it's a positive development.
Do you think that COVID-19 has given us an opportunity to look at the way education is delivered? Because it's quite clear that we were lacking a lot of things, particularly in a digital era. Do you think that even if we come back to normal in terms of having dealt with COVID-19, we've been given a window of the kind of teaching that's required going forward?
The opportunities in terms of digital learning are opportunities that we need to pursue, but we need to pursue not only with determination, also with realism. Many families who have at home a device for learners to use, who have access to Wi-Fi, who have access to reliable Wi-Fi and have access to infrastructure, have learned that even under those conditions, it's quite challenging to teach learners at home. But for the majority of South African children, the notion of an individual device for a learner and access to reliable Wi-Fi at a cost they can afford is something that we need to understand, that the ecosystem that makes that possible needs a lot of work in South Africa. Not everyone can afford the Wi-Fi that would enable to access learning. So it's a broader issue, almost outside of the control of the education department, and we do need to accelerate access to learning independently at home, as well as some of the basics, such as water infrastructure. One of the greatest challenges throughout COVID has been making sure that those schools for whom we have not yet been able to ensure a reliable supply of water were provided with water during this period. And in the readiness report that the Deputy Director General of the DBE gave to the stakeholders consultation that the Minister ran, it is clear that there's still challenges in getting water to schools. There's still inequalities throughout our education system. I think government has done very well, but we need to get the basics right, as well as work towards, as you call it, the fourth industrial revolution, so that we can do education more efficiently, more effectively, and make sure that we don't deepen inequalities.
Yeah. One other concerning statistic is this higher dropout rate that we're seeing. How do we arrest that and ensure that we get our kids back into school?
You know, dropout has been something that's worried educationists for many years. We've seen high dropout rates, particularly in high schools. The DBE stats shows that this was beginning to reduce, But with COVID, it's given us a huge knock backwards in terms of learners who have not returned to school this year. Now, leaving school is a process of disengagement and gradually weakening of connections to school. And under the alternating timetable in the early years of high school and later years of primary school, it's easy to become disengaged. Many learners move to stay with other relatives. And the Zero Dropout campaign is proposing interventions that schools and communities can take, which are as simple as monitoring, using the SASAMS, the South African School Administration Management System, to track which learners are not coming to school, reaching out to families to make sure that the families are aware that there are difficulties with the learners coming to school, making sure that in the streets where we live and work and move, that community members are encouraging learners to go to school. Now, that has become very difficult because of the alternating timetables. But without monitoring it, it's not possible to really address it. And it must be at school level and at community level that we reconnect with learners who've dropped out, encourage them to come back into a school environment which is supportive of their sense of disengagement and of their lack of confidence because of their loss of learning. Loss of learning comes with psychosocial challenges of loss of self-esteem, of feeling that I'm not going to make it, and there's no point. We have to build schools to be places where learners feel that they're valued, that they can succeed, and that they will get the support. But Peter, it's also hard on teachers. I think that our teachers have carried an enormous load, and we need to much more often as a country recognize what they have contributed all of the time, but particularly under COVID. It hasn't been easy for them.
Yeah, certainly hasn't been easy. We saw COVID-19 have an effect on the overall results for our matriculants last year. Are we likely to see the same again this year, given COVID is still with us? And will we see an adjustment in that normal curve to compensate?
Well, one of the things that Umalusi, the body that's responsible for the validity of the results, to make sure that the results have integrity, they have said, and I think most educators will think that the NSC results from one year must be comparable to other years. That means that even though under COVID, this year's grade 12s are perhaps coming with much less coverage of what they were expected to achieve in grade 11 or 12, they must write the same exam that any other year would have written, so that they go through life knowing my NSC has value. It's not one of those COVID NSCs. So we may see variations in the results, not only in grade 12, but across all of the grades, because it's going to take years to catch up with the time that's been lost. You know, learning is intensive, right from grade 1 all the way up to grade 12. And the loss of half of the school year means that there's skills, there's concepts, there's content, there's a range of foundational learning that builds the basis for subsequent years that will need time to be caught up. And I think we need to, as a country, understand that that must be a process and that it will take time. And in South Africa, we've done quite well. In countries like the UK and the US, they came back to school much later than us. One of the reasons, I think, is because in those countries, there are greater possibilities for learning at home. There's a greater abundance of resources at home. There's the greater access to IT. But even in those countries, they've had real challenges. We've done well to get back so soon. it's a problem not of anybody's making. We need to recognize that it takes all of us to solve the problems that are there. And the frustration and anxiety that parents feel sometimes makes us very critical of the education department. But they are understanding what to do under very unusual conditions. And it was very good to hear the report, for example, from the NEC for KZN, Mishingu, about how hard they're working to deal with all of these very complicated issues.
Very complicated indeed. Professor Mary Metcalfe, thank you so much. Your insights always greatly appreciated. Thank you for your time.